Children of God, on this particular day, I would like to just bring something to our attention. I told you before that the WHO is part of uh, the organization or the organizational structure that is trying to woo the world or force it. If they can't woo the world, they want to force it into a kind of a belief so that they can be able to hand over as much ground to the Antichrist as possible. But surprisingly, we had a statement from Dr. Maria van Kakov when she spoke about the transmissions, asymptomatic people. Those people do not show signs whether they can transmit the virus or not. And I want you to listen to what she said.
So there's a couple of things in the question that you just asked. One is the number of cases that are being reported as asymptomatic. And so we hear from a number of countries that X percentage of them are reported as not having symptoms, or that they are in their pre-symptomatic phase, which means it's a few days before they actually develop severe symptoms. In a number of countries, when we go back and we discuss with them, one, how are these asymptomatic cases being identified? Many of them are being identified through contact tracing, and so which is what we would want to see, in that you have a known case, you find your contacts, they're already in quarantine, hopefully, and some of them are tested, and then you pick up people who may have asymptomatic or no symptoms or even mild symptoms. The other thing we're finding is that when we actually go back and say how many of them were truly asymptomatic, we find out that many have really mild disease, very mild disease. They're not quote unquote COVID symptoms, meaning they may not have developed fever yet, they may not have had a significant cough, or they may not have shortness of breath, but some may have mild disease. Having said that, we do know that there can be people that are truly asymptomatic and PCR positive. The second part of your question is what proportion of asymptomatic individuals actually transmit. So the way that we look at that is we look at these individuals need to be followed carefully over the course of when they're detected, and looking at secondary transmission. We have a number of reports from countries who are doing very detailed contact tracing. They're following asymptomatic cases, they're following contacts, and they're not finding secondary transmission onward. It's very rare. And much of that is not published in the literature. From the papers that are published, there's one that came out from Singapore, looking at a long-term care facility. There are some household transmission studies where you follow individuals over time and you look at the proportion of those that transmit onwards. We are constantly looking at this data, and we're trying to get more information from countries to truly answer this question. It still appears to be rare that an asymptomatic individual actually transmits onward. What we really want to be focused on is following the symptomatic cases. If we followed all of the symptomatic cases, because we know that this is a respiratory pathogen, it passes from an individual through infectious droplets. If we actually followed all of the symptomatic cases, isolated those cases, followed the contacts and quarantined those contacts, we would drastically reduce. I would love to be able to give a proportion of how much transmission we would actually stop, but it would be a drastic reduction in transmission. If we could focus on that, I think we would do very, very well in terms of suppressing transmission. But from the data we have, it still seems to be rare that an asymptomatic person actually transmits onward to a secondary individual.
Exactly. But now, before 24 hours were over, she was summoned, she was reprimanded, she was forced to make a clarification, not really a clarification for the purposes of clarifying, but to align our previous comments with what the WHO would want people to believe. And you can see clearly from her body language, you can be able to tell that she is under intense pressure to make these clarifications and make them live on air. And I want you to know that we are living in the last days. Deception is real. It is catching up with these great organizations, and you can imagine how much more with the smaller nations within the community of nations. Listen to what she had to say in defense.
We'll be taking questions from the journalists and from the public as well. So my name is Nika Alexander. I'm part of the communications team here at WHO headquarters. I'm joined today by Dr. Mike Ryan. He's head of the emergencies program at WHO, and Dr. Maria van Kerkhove, who's the technical lead for COVID. Thank you both for being here. For your questions on Twitter, use hashtag AskWHO. Those of you who follow us have done this before. And on Facebook and LinkedIn, you can put your questions in the comments. If you're a journalist, please say your name and the outlet you are with. So let's start right off the top. Maria, are there a few points you'd like to clarify?
Yeah, so Nika, thanks so much for having us today and for the opportunity to chat with all of you. So there were quite a lot of messages that I received overnight and that we received about making some clarifications to some points that I made yesterday at the press conference. So I think it's important just to if I could briefly cover perhaps some of the misunderstandings from what I said yesterday. So I think what's important related to transmission is what we know, importantly what we don't know, and what we're trying to do to really understand this very complex question. So what we do know about transmission is that we know that people who are infected with COVID-19, many develop symptoms, but there are some people who do not. And so the majority of transmission that we know about is that people who have symptoms transmit the virus to other people through infectious droplets. But there are a subset of people who don't develop symptoms. And to truly understand how many people don't have symptoms, we don't actually have that answer yet. There are some estimates that suggest that anywhere between 6% of the population and 41% of the population may be infected but not have symptoms, with a point estimate of around 16%. I don't want to get too technical, but that we do know that some people who are asymptomatic or some people who don't have symptoms can transmit the virus on. And so what we need to better understand is how many of the people in the population don't have symptoms, and separately, how many of those individuals go on to transmit to others. And so what I was referring to yesterday in the press conference were a very few studies, some 2 or 3 studies that have been published that actually try to follow asymptomatic cases, so people who are infected over time, and then look at all of their contacts and see how many additional people were infected. And that's a very small subset of studies. And so I was responding to a question at the press conference. I wasn't stating a policy of WHO or anything like that. I was just trying to articulate what we know. And in that, I used the phrase very rare. And I think that that's misunderstanding to state that asymptomatic transmission globally is very rare. What I was referring to was a subset of studies. I also referred to some data that isn't published. And this is information that we receive from our member states through either presentations that they give at member state briefings or presentations that are given to us through teleconferences. As you know, and as we've said previously, we convene global expert networks. And at many of those, we discuss a lot of ongoing research, ongoing studies that are there. And I was referring to some detailed investigations, cluster investigations, case contact tracing, where we had reports from member states saying that when we follow asymptomatic cases, it's very rare, and I use the phrase very rare, that we found a secondary transmission. What I didn't report yesterday was, because this is a major unknown, because there's so many unknowns around this, some groups, some modeling groups have tried to estimate what is the proportion of asymptomatic people that may transmit. And these are estimates. And there's a big range from the different models, depending on how the models are done, where they've done, from which country. But some estimates of around 40% of transmission may be due to asymptomatic. But those are from models. And so I didn't include that in my answer yesterday, but wanted to make sure that I covered that here. Okay.
You can tell, child of God, that there are forces that are trying to make the world feel as insecure as possible so that they can appear as a solution. But we say no. And we bind the demon that is trying to deceive the world. In Jesus' mighty name, we crush it. We declare it will not be able to prosper, not in our day, not during our tenure, not during our time when we are holding the baton. We will continue to resist any manner of cajoling, any manner of pushing people and suppressing them into believing a lie. God is well able to cure, and God is well able to heal, and the threat of the COVID-19 is not as the WHO seems to push for. It is a correct standpoint which had been researched that she made the declaration in the first place. Thank God who causes such statements to come out of such places so that we can be able to understand the underlying deceptive moves. God bless you. Keep watch and remain vigilant always. And remember, Jesus heals the sick. Amen.